The New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad, which people generally just call New Haven, because it's easier than saying that whole thing, which is what I'm going to do, was a railroad that operated in New England, the United States, and it was actually born from a merger itself. What ultimately became New Haven is an amalgamation of a bunch of smaller lines, but the two main ones that first formed the initial merger that would become New York, New Haven, and Hartford were the Hartford and New Haven Railroad and the New York and New Haven Railroad, and they formally merged on July 24th, 1872. The rail line was really notable as it controlled a bunch of very key routes in New England. The area between Boston and New York City has always been ripe for economic growth and opportunities to make a lot of money, and New Haven controlled significant parts of it. For example, there was the Shoreline Railway, which was under a lease that was actually given to the New York and New Haven Railway on November 1st, 1870. The shoreline hugged the north shore of Long Island Sound from New Haven to New London, and it saw a lot of key traffic. And that wasn't the only ideal line they had under their belt. New Haven was ripe to make money, and at first things went very well. So well that it kind of became involved in just a little itsy-bitsy thing we like to call a conspiracy. Yeah, there's more to this story than just their fall, which wouldn't happen till the 1950s and 60s, but New Haven's got some baggage, as it were, that I think I should probably mention. New Haven's principal rival at the time would have been New York Central, though sometimes they actually worked with them to gain entry into places like Manhattan, as well as reach the Pennsylvania Railroad's new Pennsylvania station when Hellgate Bridge opened on March 9th, 1917. But New Haven was eyeing up the idea of completely monopolizing New England, something that you might recognize as being illegal, as monopolies completely compromise the free market nature of a capitalistic economic system. When you reach monopoly status, a company no longer has any competitors. Therefore, they can charge whatever they want for the product that only they can provide. It's deliberately anti-consumer. It's the one element of capitalism where the government absolutely has to step in and tell them to knock it off. What happened was, in the early 1900s, New York investors that were being led by J.P. Morgan gained control of the company. And yes, I mean that J.P. Morgan. The legendary J.P. Morgan. The man who won every game of Monopoly, J.P. Morgan. Those investors in 1903 installed a new president, Charles S. Mellon. Under him, they started to build lines into the Bronx, even awarding the contract to a local company to avoid friction with Tammany Hall. And in response to the contract, the New York State Legislature amended the city's charter so that franchise awarding power was removed from the City Council and given to the Board of Estimate and Apportionment, which would only become defunct in 1989. Morgan and Mellon, working together, managed to achieve a complete monopoly of transportation in southern New England. They purchased not just the other railroads, but steamship and trolley lines as well. During those years, more than 100 otherwise independent railroads would become part of New Haven. It wasn't all bad, as Mellon was a really good president and a railroad man. Under him, the line saw substantial improvement, and service was good. But Morgan and Mellon began to overextend their ambitions. They attempted to acquire or neutralize competition from other railroads in New England, including New York Central's Boston and Albany Railroad. But this constant push had left them financially weak, and in 1914, 21 directors and ex-directors of the railroad were indicted for conspiracy to monopolize interstate commerce by acquiring control of practically all the transportation facilities of New England. The whole thing was kind of a mess, but like I said, during that time they did make significant improvements, specifically electrification. New Haven actually pioneered electrification when it came to rail lines all over the world, by their use of AC current instead of DC. The project itself was very expensive, but they felt it would be worth it in the end due to the cost saving that electrification would give them. And they moved to install an 11,000 volt AC system. In the early 1900s, that was a major idea. AC is pretty standard nowadays, to be honest. But prior to New Haven doing this, railroads always did DC. But direct current has a lot of drawbacks. It provided relatively low voltage, usually no higher than 3,000. It required a lot of equipment to retain the power throughout the system, and that usually involved needing substations at regular intervals all along the lines. Alternating current didn't actually need to do this. It has none of those inherent flaws. The overhead wires are usually cheaper, and they can be strung for hundreds of miles without losing any power, even without substations. And maybe you yourself want to learn more. Well, try Brilliant, an interactive learning service that you can use both on your computer and on your phone. I myself have actually used Brilliant before. I can personally vouch for the quality of the courses involved here. Whether you want to learn something new about science or even cryptocurrency, algorithms on YouTube for example, Brilliant has a class for that. Logic, geometry, scientific thinking, science essentials, computer science fundamentals, quantum computing, it has it all. In short, interactive bite-sized portions that really help you stretch your brain, which is what I used it for. I just like logic puzzles. I just like to keep my brain sharp, and Brilliant is exceptional for that sort of thing. And best of all, it makes it fun. Learning is great on its own, but if you enjoy it too, that's so much the better if you ask me. And as an awesome super special offer just for you guys, if you look at the link just below this video, go to brilliant.org/historyinthedark, and the first 200 subscribers get 20% off. So give it a try. It's well worth it. New Haven completed the electrified territory between Woodland Junction, New York, and Stamford, Connecticut in the summer of 1907, and by 1915, those wires had reached New Haven. During the 1920s, they strung wires over 672 miles of track, and they planned to push on to Boston. Problem was, they were kind of out of money. They had spent a lot on the project, and it was a good idea, and it was doing well, but they couldn't keep spending money on building more of it. They had to take a break and back off for a bit. And as a result, they never actually reached Boston with this network. Amtrak would actually close that gap in the early 2000s to enhance their northeastern corridor. More on that later, though. Now, the AC system did have some early problems. Some failures did happen, but the technology was brand new, so that wasn't necessarily unexpected. Within a few years, they had handled most of the kinks, and they had a wide variety of electric locomotives under their roster. However, due to the expense of the project, as well as just the nature of the situation, they started to have financial difficulties during the Great Depression, which every railway did, but it hit New Haven pretty hard in particularly. In 1935, they had to declare bankruptcy, and remained in trusteeship until 1947. During that time, many of the lines they had expanded to wound up closing to save money. They had been under the guidance of a man by the name of Howard Palmer. He abolished many of the unprofitable ventures that the company still had, like the steamship and bus services they were still operating. He also streamlined operations and began to dieselize. Things were looking up, but within a year after emerging from receivership, 1948, the company would wind up falling into the hands of two men, Frederick Dumaine and Patrick McGinnis. And these two, didn't really handle things well at all. Especially McGinnis, he's an idiot. But let's explain why. The two men could be described as pencil pushers. All they saw was numbers and papers and corporate bureaucratic nonsense. They didn't see the whole scope of actually running a railroad. And that was kind of a big problem. If they ever saw a deficit in anything, they would cut costs wherever they could. And this is an issue on a railroad in particular because, frankly, there are things you have to pay for in order to keep things, safe and efficient. There are costs of operations that need to be absorbed. Sometimes cutting costs in areas is good, but if you do it too much, you can reduce the ability of the railroad to function at all. They laid off even the most veteran workers for one thing, leaving skeleton crews all over the place, many of which were highly inexperienced, and with no experienced men to actually train them. They also deferred maintenance, because of course they did. Of course they did. You don't need to maintain the rails. What could possibly happen? I feel like every fallen flag railroad I've talked about has been, at one point, deferring maintenance. Every single time. Stop doing that. The tactics only worked under the short term, because the railroad saw a deep slump, and then it fell victim to infighting. Dumaine and McGinnis, when they were around, got along, but McGinnis was super greedy, and when Dumaine died, his son, Frederick Dumaine Jr., inherited all his shares and should have been made the company's president, but McGinnis resisted that in 1954. He gained support by vowing to return more of the company's profit to shareholders, and he won control of the railroad and appointed a new man, Arthur V. McGowan, as the vice president. But McGinnis, like I said earlier, is an idiot, at least when it comes to running a railway. Most of his financial goals were out of his reach. This was the 50s, and the rail industry in general was on kind of a downslope due to planes and cars. He attempted to accomplish most of his goals by deferring all but the most basic maintenance, while at the same time spending lavishly on a new visual identity for the company. changing the old green and gold trim to a black, red, orange, and white, and giving them a stylized NH emblem. Now, did the new livery look nice? Yeah. Was it a complete waste of money at the time? Yeah, definitely. Why are you spending money on paint jobs? Your railway's literally falling apart, and you're trying to repaint everything. Oh, yeah, by the way, McGuinness and McGowan had Chrysler Imperial automobiles custom-made so they could travel along the railroad's tracks to their country estates in Litchfield County, Connecticut. Because of course they did. You know, J.P. Morgan did win at capitalism, but he still knew what was best for the rail line and did good things for it. McGuinness and McGowan seemed like a couple of blockheads, if you ask me. When McGuinness finally departed just 22 months after he gained power, he left the company financially destroyed. And the 1955 Connecticut floods definitely didn't help things. It was one of the worst floods in the state's history. 2 back-to-back hurricanes had saturated the land, and it caused severe flooding in August of 1955. 87 people were killed, and property damage across the state was estimated at more than $200 million. That's in 1955 money. The railroad's directors had had enough of McGuinness's nonsense even when he finally left, and he was replaced with a man by the name of George Alpert. Now, Alpert wasn't necessarily a bad leader. He was a good fit for the role and did his best to fix the company's problems. But McGuinness had dug them into such a profound hole that Alpert was hard-pressed to do much about it. Due to a dying freight and passenger market, too many light-density branch lines that just needed to be closed, as well as the rail network in general being too saturated by other competitors who were in much better condition, Alpert couldn't do a lot. The company was effectively destitute, and they declared bankruptcy again in 1961. The future for them looked bleak, and the ICC wasn't really sure what to do about it. There were certain areas of the network that needed to still have the rail lines, but fixing New Haven's issues would be difficult. Receivership may not be enough this time. Reorganization might work, but what else were they going to do? Oh, New York Central and the Pennsylvania Railroad want to merge? Oh, can you take this off our hands? Yep, if you remember correctly from my video about Penn Central, New Haven wanted to be included in that merger as a condition given to them by the ICC. Recognize that one of Penn Central's biggest issues was that the management from the Pennsy and the management from New York Central couldn't agree on anything. But you know what they did agree on? Nobody wanted New Haven. None of them. Not a single one supported the idea. They all fiercely resisted the concept because New Haven was that bad, and they knew taking on the burden of fixing their issues was going to be financially disastrous. But they weren't given a choice. It was either take New Haven or don't merge at all. So they did. Now, Penn Central's problems weren't just because they took over New Haven, but it certainly didn't help. Penn Central was an unmitigated disaster, the largest bankruptcy of its time, and they were already experiencing issues when they finally formally took control of New Haven on January 1st, 1969. Frankly, the act of doing so was kind of like if you were already on a sinking ship, and then you just set it on fire. Because why not at that point? That's kind of how that went. Though Penn Central officially declared their bankruptcy on June 21st, 1970, the situation wouldn't really start to be resolved until 1976. Penn Central controlled a huge part of the Northeast United States. They couldn't just shut them down and do nothing. It would leave many smaller rail lines stranded, with no connections, and other industries that depended on the railways without an effective means to transport their goods. The federal government would wind up forming the Consolidated Rail Corporation, comprised of what was left of several bankrupt northeastern carriers. They were officially launched on April 1st, 1976. Though that seems like an April Fool's joke given the date, Conrail was no joke. Conrail actually did solid work to bring the struggling rail networks back into the black. By the late 80s, they were profitable, after thousands of miles of excess trackage was abandoned or upgraded. New Haven's secondary lines comprised a portion of the abandonments. Large sections were let go and considered superfluous for a railroad just trying to recover. But that doesn't mean every single part of them was no longer used, and there was a big element that I mentioned earlier that is still being used, by Amtrak. The New York to Boston Main Line was an important link for both freight and passengers. Amtrak uses it as a major component of their Northeast Corridor, which is one of their busiest sections of line and one of their most well-engineered. On top of that, there are quite a few preserved locomotives that originally are from New Haven that are still around at various museums. And interestingly, the Connecticut Department of Transportation wound up using McGinnis's livery for their own CT rail service. And it is a nice livery, I will admit, so it's nice to see it still around. Now, Baldwin's interesting because unlike Alco, which, as I mentioned in that video, started out as a locomotive manufacturer because it was the product of a merger of a bunch of other then locomotive manufacturers, Baldwin was never the product of a merger, and they did not start out as locomotive manufacturers at all. The founder of the company was one Matthias W. Baldwin, and he was a jeweler and a whitesmith. A whitesmith is similar to a blacksmith. They're metalworkers, but they do finishing work on iron and steel, like filing and polishing. Sometimes it's used as a synonym for a tinsmith, but the point is he did, like, the light work on metal, not the hardcore stuff that blacksmiths tend to do. But in 1825, he formed a partnership with machinist David H. Mason and engaged in the manufacture of bookbinders tools, as well as cylinders, for calico printing. Calico is heavy, plain woven textile. This business proved to be successful, and eventually Baldwin designed and constructed a small stationary engine for his own use. But the engine was so good that he was solicited to build others that were just like it, and this turned his attention to steam engineering. The original engine was in use and powered many departments in the works for well over 60 years, and is actually currently on display at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. In 1831, Baldwin wound up building a miniature locomotive that was used for exhibition at the request of the Philadelphia Museum. This was incredibly successful, so much so that he received an order that year from a railway company for a full-size locomotive to run on the short line to the suburbs of Philadelphia. While this was going on, the Camden and Amboy Railroad, or CNA, had imported another locomotive called the John Bull from England, but it had been shipped in pieces and hadn't been assembled yet. When Baldwin himself came for a visit, he inspected the detached parts and made notes of principal dimensions. These figures would go into how he would design his full-size locomotive. This was tremendously difficult for him, as for one, he'd never done one this size before, and modern machine tools just didn't exist back then. The cylinders were bored by a chisel fixed on a block of wood, and turned by hand. The workmen under Baldwin actually had to be taught to do nearly the whole thing, and Baldwin himself did a great deal with his own hands, and even he didn't really know what he was doing. But the locomotive turned out alright, all things considered. She was christened Old Ironsides, and wound up being tried on the Philadelphia, Germantown, and Norristown Railroad on November 23, 1832. She did well, and was put into active service, which lasted about 20 years. She wasn't perfect, as her performance was a little less than the railroad had expected, or even Baldwin had expected, so Baldwin accepted a smaller payment in exchange for the locomotive to make up for this element. Solidifying himself as an honest businessman, as well as a competent one, he started receiving orders for even more locomotives. The future of the Baldwin Machine Company, soon to be called the Baldwin Locomotive Works, had just been solidified. From then on, the vast majority of what they did was building steam locomotives. The construction of railroads was in high form during the 1800s. Everybody with the money and know-how was trying to do it, as it was the fastest way to travel, and it helped build America in general. Railroad tycoons all over the place were trying to make a name for themselves and their companies by attempting to become the first to connect various cities. In order to do this, they needed locomotives, and Baldwin was in a position to supply those, as well as start experimenting and innovating with more modern locomotive designs. Like any company, there were ups and downs even during this time. The Panic of 1837 was a problem, as production fell from 40 locomotives that year to just 9 in 1840, though he took on some partners in order to mitigate this problem, as he was a very competent businessman as well as a genius when it came to machine working. In fact, during the 1850s, things had bounced back so much that Baldwin was having trouble keeping pace with the orders. There were just so many of them. In order to compensate for this, he began paying his workers piece rate instead of salary or hourly. This is something that is often frowned upon in today's society. Piece rate basically means they only get paid per piece, per work that is done. At the time, it was considered a good way to help motivate workers in order to actually, work. But it can result in a company exploiting its workers by mysteriously not keeping track of how many pieces they've done, or simply making it impossible to complete a piece in time, and it also causes workers desperately in need of pay to overwork themselves, or even do shoddy work at times in an effort to rush things. It's not really a great system, and it did not last forever. But the point was, it was an attempt to improve output, something they desperately needed because the company was growing, and growing quite fast. Even during the Panic of 1857, when output fell by nearly 50%, things bounced back during the Civil War. Because, well, at first it was bad, because a lot of railways in the South suddenly just straight up weren't buying from Baldwin. But the newly established United States military railroads needed a whole bunch of locomotives for the war effort, and the Pennsylvania Railroad in particular saw its traffic soar into the stratosphere, so they needed a bunch too. Baldwin produced more than 100 engines for carriers during this time, and Baldwin himself would wind up passing away in 1866. At the time, his company was vying for the top spot among locomotive producers, with Rogers Locomotive and Machine Works. But even though the founder was gone, the company moved forward, and moved forward astonishingly well. By 1870, Baldwin was the #1 locomotive manufacturer in America, and by 1880, they were producing 2.5 times as many engines as their nearest competitor. They were top tier in terms of locomotive design, as well as production. By that time, they were actually still using the piece rate system, and interestingly, it had been working really well for Baldwin. The workers, despite working under a piece rate system, were paid fairly based off of what they were doing, and there's no evidence of the company ever exploiting the piece rate system to underpay their workers. It never altered them. If the workers did the work, they were paid appropriately. Again, it would not last forever, but Baldwin is actually one example where a piece rate system actually kind of worked, at least for a little while. The American railroad industry itself was in the middle of kind of a boom during the early 1900s. Domestic demand for locomotives hit its highest point in 1905. This of course caused Baldwin's business to just be phenomenal. They were selling locomotives left and right, producing them every single day. It was great for the company, but they did have some challenges. For one thing, growth is good, but they were located at Broad Street in Philadelphia. That shop was starting to become very cramped. They just didn't have the space for the amount of production they were putting out. There were also labor tensions, as well as increased labor costs, partially due to some economic inflation that was going on. These were things that had to be overcome, but given the company was doing so well, having to pay their workers more wasn't necessarily something they couldn't handle. But what was making the space issue even worse was that locomotives themselves were getting larger. Some steam locomotives were getting positively gigantic, and would only keep getting bigger towards the end of the steam age. Baldwin would have to do something about this, especially if they were going to compete with the newly formed Alco. A monster of an organization, Alco was good at what they were doing, and Lima was still chilling in the background too. They were never as large as the others, but they were good at technical innovation, something Baldwin had to keep an eye on if they were going to retain their #1 position. Starting in 1904, Baldwin also started experimenting with other forms of traction. They didn't want to just focus on steam, they knew there were other ways to do it, and they thought it might be a good idea to try working with electric locomotives, as well as the AC electrification of railroads, in particular with New Haven. They worked with Westinghouse on this, and the electric locomotives that came out of this partnership were known as Baldwin-Westinghouse. Baldwin had little experience with electronics, but they did know how to build a locomotive. Westinghouse, well, electricity was their thing, so the partnership made sense, and it worked out well for both of them for a while. They produced many different electric locomotives, and for a time were actually the #1 when it came to producing this type of locomotive in America. The relationship between Baldwin and Westinghouse would last for decades. The industry hit a big snag in 1906 with the introduction of something called the Hepburn Act, which authorized greater governmental authority over railroad companies, as well as revitalizing the Interstate Commerce Commission, the ICC. I feel like they come up a lot, even now. Talk about manufacturers, and yet here they are. The ICC, as you may already know if you've watched my other railroad documentaries, had the power to set maximum railroad rates, as well as replace existing rates with quote-unquote just and reasonable maximum rates, which were defined by the ICC. This limited railroad securities, and meant that railroads, in an effort to save money, to try to reorient themselves, stopped ordering new equipment, like, locomotives, which Baldwin made. And that was bad. Baldwin's output dropped from 2,666 locomotives in 1906 to just 614 in 1908. They had to cut their workforce from 18,499 to 4,600. Then one of their partners, William P. Hensey, actually died, and his death left Baldwin with a $6 million liability. So in response, Baldwin Incorporated and released $10 million worth of bonds. The president of Baldwin at the time, Samuel Matthews Vauclin, wanted to use these funds to expand Baldwin's capacities, so it would prepare for another economic boom. His other officers actually opposed the expansion given they were kind of struggling at the time, but Vauclin won out in the end. In order to deal with their space issues, they built an absolutely massive plant in Eddystone, Pennsylvania, which was finally completed in 1928. That year, they moved all locomotive production to that location, but the plant was way too big for what they actually needed. Vauclin had seriously overestimated the demand for Baldwin products. Even though they would continue to make steam locomotives for another couple decades, that plant never exceeded more than 1/3 of its production capacity. That's a lot of wasted space, and a lot of wasted money. Another short-sighted element for Baldwin was of course the advent of diesels, but believe it or not, in 1925, Baldwin did become the first American locomotive builder to develop a road diesel locomotive. Now I'm sure you're a bit confused because I said last time that Alco was the first to do that. No, I didn't say that. I said Alco were the ones to make the first commercially successful diesel locomotive. Baldwin made the first one that was a road diesel locomotive. It had an ambitious for the time twin-engine design, and it was scrapped after a short testing and demonstration period. They had worked with Westinghouse on the project, and later collaborated with them again in 1929 to produce some more road diesels that still didn't work. They were called Canadian National Class V1As, number 9000 and 9001. They were expensive, unreliable, and were retired very quickly. Westinghouse themselves canceled their efforts in the diesel locomotive field, especially since the Great Depression loomed on the horizon, deciding to restrict themselves to only supplying electrical components, which they were very good at. And for Baldwin's part, well, these early failures led them on the path to believe that diesels weren't the replacement for steam at all. Diesels were unreliable. They didn't work. They just weren't as good as steam locomotives. It was that simple. And Baldwin was very, very, very sure of this. Definitely 100%. There was no question about it. In fact, in 1930, Vauclin stated in a speech that advances in steam technology would ensure its dominance until at least 1980. Oh no, that, I am so sorry. That is so wrong, sir. Baldwin's vice president and director of sales also then stated later in December of 1937 that sometime in the future, when all this is reviewed, it will be found that our railroads are no more dieselized than they electrified. Oh no. See, what was going on was EMD, then EMC, were again working on their new diesel electrics and showing them off to railway companies, insisting that they were the future. Alco was also attempting to enter this market, but Baldwin, due to their early failures with diesel locomotives, genuinely didn't believe that this was anything more than a fad. That soon, everyone would remember how great steam engines are, and the diesels would prove to be inefficient and unreliable, just like the ones they had made. Of course, being completely ignorant to the notion that, yeah, your early diesels were really bad, but that was kind of your fault. It had nothing to do with the actual potential of well-made diesel electrics. It had to do with your failures. And this was Baldwin's critical mistake in this field. After their failures, they stopped researching diesels altogether and fully committed to steam, as well as electric locomotives with Westinghouse. But even that was proven to be a concern. They'd lost their dominant position in that market when the Pennsylvania Railroad chose to accept General Electric's design for a new electric over Baldwin's. That GE design would become the GG1 class, which would run for many decades. Baldwin's design was put to the side and later scrapped, and left them with a bit of a black eye over the whole thing. They also went through a bankruptcy in 1935 due to the Depression, though they would emerge from that relatively unscathed. But with all this going on during the 30s, they had been put in a very, very, very far behind position when it came to R&D, especially when it came to diesels. A change in management in 1938 saw this change, to at least attempt to be. The new suit saw that diesels could, in fact, be a competitor to steam, and should be looked into by the company if they were going to remain competitive themselves. But some historians consider this change possibly too late. In 1939, Baldwin did in fact offer their first standard line of diesel locomotives, but they were all yard switchers. They weren't meant for main line service, which was a problem because EMC was pushing for that at that point, and Alco was following suit. Additionally, Baldwin had to consider some of their principal customers, namely the Pennsylvania Railroad, Chesapeake and Ohio, and Norfolk and Western. Those railroads in particular were a lot more reluctant to embrace technology that would undermine the demand for one of their main hauling markets, coal. The steam engines used coal. The diesels did not. And those railroads did not want to undermine their own customers, so they kept using steam for a lot longer, especially Norfolk and Western. And because of this, they still needed Baldwin to make steam locomotives, and it led Baldwin to not only not commit to diesel development, but to wrongly assume that this type of thing would last forever. And this was always Baldwin's biggest issue, and it's something that we see a lot when it comes to any kind of company or even individuals. The term is called complacency. You expect things to stay the way they are, and get lazy about making any changes. And when the situation starts to change, you're so caught up with the way things were that you yourself refuse to adapt to the new landscape. That was Baldwin's problem. They were complacent. They weren't willing to change, not as readily as other companies were. And with new competitors and new technology on the horizon, they really needed to. Even if some of their customers still wanted them to make steam locomotives, that was fine, but they needed to invest in new diesels, and to figure out how to actually make a diesel, even while they were building some of the largest steam locomotives ever seen, such as their duplex drive S1 for the Pennsylvania Railroad. They would also design the T1, as well as invest in a different kind of technology, steam turbines, producing the S2. None of these designs were considered particularly successful for a variety of reasons. While the S1 and the T1 probably could have been, given enough time to work out the kinks, the turbines never did well at any point. Not a single one of Baldwin's turbines worked itself out. And World War II threw a bit of a wrench into their plan to actually produce diesels. See, the War Production Board dictated that both them and Alco produce only steam locomotives and diesel-electric yard-switching engines. Nothing bigger than that. EMC was assigned the task of producing road freight diesels. That had the somewhat unintentional consequence of making it so that Alco and Baldwin couldn't actually develop tech when it came to road freight diesels, whereas EMC could continue investing in this market, putting both those companies further behind than they otherwise would have been, especially Baldwin. They produced a lot of steam locomotives during the war, as well as several tanks, such as the M3 and the M4. And the war economy certainly helped them, but they were still behind in terms of technology. During the war, they had developed a prototype, the 4-8 plus 8-4 750/8DE1, their first attempt at building a road diesel locomotive. This was the prototype to what would become known as the Baldwin Centipede, or if you like really long designations, the Baldwin DR-12-8-1500/2. Does it look ridiculous? Yes, and if there was ever an indication that Baldwin did not know exactly how diesels worked or how they should be built, this was it. They did not know what they were doing. The wheel arrangement on this thing is, well, under AAR, it's 2-D plus D-2. If that sounds weird, well, it's easier to say under the white notation. You know, the thing we use for steam locomotives. It's a 4884. That's the same wheel arrangement as a big boy. Why are there leading and trailing wheels on a diesel? That's not how these work. But Baldwin went with that. Having that many wheels didn't really enhance them at all. Plus, it made them a maintenance nightmare. And even without that, they would have been because of Baldwin's manufacturing practices. Baldwin made all their locomotives one at a time, as they always had done. EMC, now known as EMD, produced them like cars in an assembly line. This not only made them cheaper to make and sped up production, but it also assured that every single one of their diesels would be pretty much identical. Baldwin's manufacturing method was slower, more expensive, and it made sure that each diesel would be a little bit different due to them being made independently. This drove everyone nuts. The railroads, who had been starting to struggle, needed to save money wherever they could, and they found that maintenance was a lot easier on the EMD diesels. This thing was not any easier, it was a lot harder, it was way more annoying for everybody involved, and it was not considered successful, even though Baldwin wound up building 54, most of which went to the Pennsylvania Railroad. To their credit, after the Centipede debacle, they did start getting their act together at least a little bit when it came to producing diesels. Their yard switchers were never actually that terrible. They could make those, and make them pretty well. And post the Centipede, not every single one of their main line diesels was necessarily bad, but they were still focused on steam turbines for a while, producing one for Norfolk and Western in 1954, which didn't work. Due to rapid dieselization, Baldwin was pretty much left out in the cold. Even Alco, which was struggling, had some acceptable mainline diesels they could sell, and Baldwin struggled to find a place in the market, and made silly mistakes when it came to a lot of their diesels. Whereas EMD was very consistent and aggressive when it came to advertising and marketing, and Alco had learned from a lot of their mistakes, Baldwin, well, for example, the RF-16, which started production in November of 1950, couldn't be used in multiple unit operation without special add-on equipment, because it used an air-powered throttle. EMD and Alco units didn't have this problem. It was just this weird, stupid, minor stuff that always made Baldwin units slightly worse than their competitors. They had no way into the market, and it got so bad that Westinghouse had to step in. They still had a very close working relationship with Baldwin and purchased 500,000 shares of Baldwin stock. That was 21% of the company, and made them the largest shareholder. That extra money helped Baldwin cover various debts they owed, and Westinghouse's vice president, Marvin Smith, became Baldwin's president in May of 1949. They realized they might not be able to handle the locomotive market anymore, so they tried to diversify into construction equipment instead. But their days were still numbered. Internally, they were a mess, and they were panicking. Like I said, they had gotten complacent for so long, and their company was rapidly falling to pieces. Their sales had dried up. They weren't making any money. Then they merged with Lima Hamilton on December 4th, 1950, to become Baldwin Lima Hamilton. That meant they could combine their assets as well as their locomotive technology, but Baldwin was kind of in charge of the whole thing, and the decision was made to only use Baldwin-built diesel tech, not Lima's. Lima didn't have a lot, but what they did have was actually alright. It was workable. They just chose not to use it at all and only pushed for Baldwin's diesels, which was a stupid decision. Why would you ever do that? They continued to deteriorate from there. In January of 1952, they closed the factory in Rochelle, Illinois, and consolidated everything at Eddystone. In 1953, Westinghouse discontinued building electrical traction equipment entirely, and that forced Baldwin to reconfigure their drive systems based on General Electric equipment. In 1954, they were basically shut out of the diesel market entirely, and their last batch of conventional steam locomotives built by them were WG Class 9100 to 9149, which were built in 1955 for the Indian Railway's broad gauge. The last locomotives that Baldwin ever built were 3 experimental RP-210 dual-power passenger locomotives for New York Central, as well as New York, New Haven, and Hartford in 1956, and they sucked. You're probably familiar with these. Just like the Centipede, these appeared on my worst trains ever lists. because they were terrible. They were awful. They broke down all the time, they were nearly impossible to maintain because they had to use old Volkswagen parts, and the only manuals available for the engines they used were available in German, and nothing else. They were a disaster, and after that, Baldwin left the locomotive business. After 125 years in 1956, they closed most of the Eddystone plant, and concentrated on producing heavy construction equipment instead. At the time of the closure, more than 70,500 locomotives had been built by Baldwin. They trucked on with the construction equipment thing for a while, and in 1965, they became a wholly owned subsidiary of Armour & Company. Then, Greyhound Corporation purchased Armour & Company in 1970, and the decision was made to liquidate all production entirely. In 1972, Greyhound closed Baldwin Lima Hamilton for good. They were done. However, some of their locomotives were still in use, and the replacement and renewal parts business was acquired by Ecolair Incorporated, which was named the Baldwin Hamilton Company, a division of Ecolair Incorporated. That actually lasted until 1991, but only existed to receive license fees from other companies using their designs. It was lucrative for a time, but when the licenses ran out, the company had no purpose. All remaining parts were distributed, and the company dissolved. These days, Baldwin Locomotive Works is of course just a memory. They no longer exist, and their death was a sign of a dying age. Frankly, I look at Baldwin's shutdown of all locomotive production as the exact point the steam age was over. But during that time, they were exceptional. They were number one in the field, producing some of the most amazing steam locomotives that have ever run on the rails, many of which are still in preservation even now. You'd have trouble going to a railway museum in America and not finding at least one Baldwin product because of how prevalent they were. Their locomotives were good, real good, and they did solid work for many years. But because of this, they got complacent, and if I dare say so myself, lazy. They didn't want to change. They didn't want to evolve. They weren't willing to see the writing on the wall. For the most part, they pretended that none of it was happening until it was far, far too late to catch up. No one took them seriously as a diesel manufacturer, especially when their first outings were, frankly, laughable. Some of their diesels were alright, and had very, very, very crisp designs. The shark noses, for example, I think look even better than the EMD units. But they didn't sell, and when it comes to a company, that's the bottom line. Are you making a product that people want? Are you making a product that people are going to buy? Remember, as a locomotive manufacturer, Baldwin was in a limited market. They only had so many customers. Only so many people would actually want to buy a locomotive, because there were only so many railways and so many factories that needed them. Regular people walking on the street might go into any department store and purchase a product from there, but how many of them would walk into Baldwin Locomotive Works and ask them to make them a full-size steam locomotive? Not many. And in that kind of industry, you had to be very, very careful with not alienating your only customers. And that's exactly what Baldwin did. The market shifted completely. Everyone wanted diesels, something Baldwin just couldn't provide. Even Alco was in a position to at least give that a try. Baldwin barely could, and it was their undoing in the end. But that said, they're still looked back on fondly, especially for rail fans. Like I said, many of their steam locomotives, and even some of their diesels, are in preservation, some in running condition, and they'll always be a critical and major part of American locomotive history. And I suppose that's one victory. They went down in history. It's not something every company is capable of doing, so you have to give them that much. The Milwaukee Road survived for quite a decent amount of time, and it had its ups and downs over the years. It began official operation in 1847, known as the Milwaukee and Waukesha Railroad, although almost immediately they would change their name to the Milwaukee and Mississippi Railroad. Eventually, they would come to be called the Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul and Pacific Railroad, or CM St. P&P, which, no matter how you say that, that's a mouthful, and they must have known it, because generally people, even in the company, just referred to the rail line as the Milwaukee Road. Even their logo called it that. Though they survived for that whole time, they actually went through multiple bankruptcies. It's just they always managed to reorganize, or be held in receivership until the situation improved. One of their first mistakes, that shouldn't have been a mistake but it turned out to be, was their Pacific extension. In the 1890s, they felt they had to extend the railroad to the Pacific to remain competitive. This isn't unreasonable. In 1901, they estimated the cost to do this is $45 million. That's $1.47 billion today, so this was a massive project. And in 1905, they actually approved the project, which was estimated then at $60 million, or $1.81 billion. Construction officially began in 1906 and was completed in 3 years. The route chosen actually wound up being 18 miles shorter than their next shortest competitors' lines. But it was also very expensive, as the Milwaukee Road received very few government grants for territory regarding building this project, so they had to buy most of the land or acquire smaller railroads that were in the area. It was a rough area to build in, and this was over the Rocky Mountains and the Cascades. The civil engineering that it took to accomplish this feat was not cheap at all. Additionally, while the route seemed good at first, historians point out now that it bypassed a lot of major population centers and passed through areas that had very limited local traffic potential. So, in some ways, it wasn't necessarily an ideal line in terms of efficiency. It also tended to parallel the Northern Pacific Railway. Even once it was done, operating conditions on that line were extremely difficult. Winter temperatures in that area reached negative 40 degrees, which is a really fun thing to say, because negative 40 is the only time where the Fahrenheit scale and the Celsius scale actually intersect and mean the same temperature. Therefore, I could say negative 40 degrees, and regardless of which temperature scale you use, you know that means really cold! It made it difficult for steam locomotives to generate enough steam in those areas. As a result, they began looking at electrification, because there was abundant hydroelectric power in the mountains, as well as a nearby ready source of copper for wiring. Between 1914 and 1916, the road implemented a 3,000-volt direct current overhead system between Harleton, Montana, and Avery, Idaho. That was a distance of 438 miles, or 705 kilometers. It worked really well, so they again electrified another route, between Othello, Washington, and Tacoma, Washington, another 207 miles between 1970 and 1920. At the time, this was actually the largest mainline electrification project in the world, and it wouldn't be exceeded in the United States until the Pennsylvania Railroad's efforts in the 1930s to electrify their own routes. But the thing about this particular electrification project is they never unified the sections of lines. So there was a weird middle section where they had to switch back to steam travel for the trains. It was kind of inefficient in that way, but it did still help. The electrified lines actually saved them over $1 million per year for a while, and it motivated them to get more electric locomotives, such as the very successful bipolar units. But the Pacific Extension in general still wound up being a complete financial disaster. They never saw a return on the investment the way they expected. In order to meet costs, they actually sold bonds, but those bonds would become due in the 1920s. Traffic never picked up. To make matters worse, they purchased a bunch of highly indebted railroads in Indiana, for reasons that I still don't fully understand. They finally wound up declaring bankruptcy themselves in 1925, and that's when they finally reorganized the Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul, and Pacific Railroad in 1928. But they never had a chance to make it through the Great Depression with their financial difficulties, and they had to declare bankruptcy again in 1935. They operated under trusteeship until December 1st, 1945. The post-war boom helped them a lot. They did have good rolling stock, don't get me wrong. They had the famous Hiawatha high-speed steam locomotives. Those things are both distinctive for their streamlining and ability. They exceeded 100 miles per hour, or 160 kilometers an hour, on the regular. It wasn't like the rail line didn't have good things about them, it was just their management style was horrible. By the 50s, things were going a little bit more downhill. Just like pretty much every railroad during that time, the Milwaukee Road began to see excess competition from both planes and cars. They were also in a particularly weird area where a ton of other railroads were actually outcompeting them very easily. It was overbuilt. And then finally, in 1957, their president, John P. Kiley, resigned, and they replaced him with a man by William John Quinn. This was kind of a major moment for the railroad. See, the thing about Quinn is that it isn't necessarily that he was dumb or inept, but he was very inexperienced. and he tended to get fixated on a lot of ideas that never really turned out well. Ever. Under Quinn, the railroad began an idea of possibly merging with a larger railroad to bail them out of their troubles. Rather than do anything to fix their situation on their own, they fully expected that they would be attractive enough to line up a merger with another rail line. This pretty much would never actually happen. Hey there, Mr. Union Pacific. You want some of what, we're cooking? No. No? But we're orange. Look at how orange we are. Don't you like... No. Please? No! The road kind of waddled along throughout most of the 60s, Quinn even leaving for a short time and then returning to become chairman, while another man, Worthington Smith, would become president of the Milwaukee Road on June 15, 1972. The 70s are where things really got awkward for the Milwaukee Road. For one thing, they'd already been trying to deal with the constant enemy of railway innovation during the 50s and 60s, the Interstate Commerce Commission. Oh yes, they're back again. And yes, they completely destroyed the Milwaukee Road at every turn. Despite approving the Penn Central merger, in 1969 the ICC blocked the merger that the Milwaukee Road had been counting on with the Chicago and Northwestern Railway. This wasn't because the ICC didn't want to allow it, but they had asked for terms that the Chicago and Northwestern wasn't willing to agree to. At the same time, they had approved the merger of the Hill lines. This resulted in the formation of Burlington Northern, a major competitor for the already struggling Milwaukee Road. In 1973, things seemed fine, as the Milwaukee Road actually showed an increase in traffic during those years. But nothing was being done to sustain or continue that growth. They still deferred maintenance, with derailments becoming more common, and branch line trackage had been bleeding for years, and they allowed those lines to continue running even though they were dragging them backwards. It didn't make any sense. By comparison, Chicago and Northwestern had been trimming its system down, getting rid of unprofitable lines. A lot of rail lines did it that way. They had to in order to stay afloat, but the Milwaukee Road wasn't doing it. That same year, 1973, they were still fixated on the idea of merging with someone else. Did you even want to still be a rail line? I'm just confused at this point. They filed a petition with the ICC, requesting to be included in the Burlington Northern merger. This was rejected, because of course it was, as this was counterintuitive to what the ICC had envisioned for rail lines in the northern tier of the states. Milwaukee was supposed to be a competitor to Burlington Northern in that region, a competitor that needed to exist in order for Burlington Northern not to have a monopoly on the area. Burlington Northern didn't even want to merge with them. They broke off talks about it just the following year, stating that the merger wouldn't be in the best interest of Burlington Northern or its stockholders. Hey, Burlington Northern, don't you want a piece of... No! No! No one wants you! Get out of here! You don't have to be so mean about it. The motivations of the actual higher-ups at Milwaukee Road are seriously questionable during this period. The president, Worthington Smith, was quoted as saying that shortly after the merger proposal that the elimination of redundant and unnecessary rail facilities is an absolute must for the future. The timing of him saying that seems to suggest that Smith felt the railroad was redundant. The Milwaukee Road just didn't need to exist anymore. But the traffic charts at the time were up. It suggested that people did want to use the road, but the management didn't see it that way. They also weren't using any extra money they might be generating to maintain their track. The track in some areas was so bad that one time the Milwaukee Road refused to operate a circus train jointly with the Southern Railway because they were afraid that if the train derailed, animals would run wild. This normally wouldn't be a concern, but the track was that bad and they knew it. Then they also made a really controversial decision, one that was probably one of the most infamous things they did. The electrified portion of their lines that I mentioned before? Well, it had a bunch of copper wiring. Milwaukee decided, copper prices are at over $1 a pound and there's 10 million pounds of it hanging over our right-of-way in the West. Be a shame if someone cut it all down. They decided to shut down electrification. All the electrified lines were shut down and the wires removed and sold off. They also felt that they should have a consolidated system before they approached the ICC about that merger with Burlington Northern. Remember the one that they didn't actually get? But this was done before they even submitted the petition for inclusion with Burlington Northern. They did look at the idea of rehabilitating the lines, It showed that at the cost of $39 million, the system could be renewed with new locomotives, power supplies, and also close that gap that I mentioned before. If those lines out west were fully electrified, that would have meant $21 million worth of diesel locomotives could be sent back to the east, reducing their net cost there to just $18 million. General Electric even formally proposed financing the project themselves, but Chairman Quinn said no, saying that their company had more immediate needs. This is despite the fact that he knew and admitted that at current traffic levels and fuel prices, the rehabilitated electrification of those lines would have paid for itself in just 11 years, which is a pretty decent turnaround time for a project of that scale. Instead, though, they still spent $39 million, the same amount they would have spent to rehabilitate the lines, to tear them down, and completely dieselize the lines out west, while receiving only $5 million for the copper scrap, as prices by that point had dramatically fallen. Yeah, by the way, it's probably worth mentioning, and this is really important to me and I want to stress this, this was done during the oil embargo that was going on in the 1970s. The 1970s oil crisis, yeah, that was happening at that point. Running diesel locomotives was actually violently expensive, way more than it ever had been. And this is during a time when electricity prices were remaining fairly stable. By June 15th of 1974, the last electric run was made, and diesels cost twice as much to operate as the electrics did. They still went through with this! The worst part is, in a study that was done by Michael Soul, he found that if the electrification had been done as it existed in 1972, operating at maximum capacity with no additional locomotives, the Milwaukee Road would have saved about $32.6 million by the end of 1977, and $67.8 million by 1980. Factoring in the increases in diesel fuel costs. That meant that renewing the system would have paid for itself in only 4 years. During that time, they also had a really just unspeakably stupid idea of turning away what they called non-compensatory traffic. Today, a lot of people still aren't sure exactly what the company considered falling under that term, but it was known they had a habit of refusing to supply cars to their customers. The decision to de-electrify the western portion was crippling. In 1975 alone, they lost a total of $37.9 million. In order to compensate for what I can only assume was their complete and unholy inability to actually run a rail line or make any competent decision during this time, the Milwaukee Road had a habit of taking profits from the Milwaukee Land Company. MLC was a wholly owned subsidiary of the railroad, and profits from them were used to prop up profits during lean years on the actual rail lines. Instead of using the money taken from MLC to actually improve the railroad, by the way, it's been shown that they actually used them to finance purchases of the Chicago-Milwaukee Corporation, another holding company formed in 1972. Those sales, by the way, weren't reported to stockholders, and that would lead to them getting in trouble with the Securities Exchange Commission, or SEC. In 1975, the SEC would file charges in the federal court accusing the management of the Milwaukee Road of defrauding the company and its shareholders by selling assets without informing the stockholders or the SEC, with deferring maintenance on the track facilities without proper disclosure, and of otherwise falsifying the company books. The investigation that followed found that the MLC had, quote-unquote, purchased $12 million in land from a company that was owned by Chicago-Milwaukee Corporation as an investment, but the land couldn't be identified. While the railroad was struggling and needed money to right itself, Chicago-Milwaukee Corp was pulling money out of its subsidiary for its own use. Another interesting fact that came out during the investigation, and in fact during a testimony by Worthington Smith himself, concerned Milwaukee's car fleet, the rolling stock. Milwaukee Road had a huge fleet of home-built boxcars, and the equipment trust certificates had long been paid off on them. Since there were no longer any finance charges on these cars, they provided a higher return of net revenue. That's good, but starting in the early 60s, Milwaukee Road had started using these cars as a means of generating cash by rebuilding a portion of the fleet and reselling them to financial institutions. They would then lease them back to themselves, with the cars never actually leaving the property. Why would they want to do this? Well, it did give them immediate money. It was cheaper to lease a car than outright buy one, and the price they charged for selling them was actually pretty high. They made more money than they would spend on leasing, at least for a few years. But after a while, things started compounding. In 1961, when this practice started, they only spent $3 million on lease charges. That's actually pretty low for a company of this size. But by 1969, that grew to over $20 million. Again, these were cars they used to own, but they weren't paying anything on. But every single year, the situation compounded and got worse and worse and worse. They kept rebuilding, selling, and leasing their own cars back to themselves, while they stopped buying new rolling stock. By 1974, they were spending more on their old rebuilt fleet than they were on any new cars, and by 1977, they were spending $65 million per year for its own rolling stock, while spending less than $20 million on new. It was ridiculous, absurd, insane, and it's considered one of the biggest reasons why their financial situation never improved. As for the SEC's charges against the company, well, the directors wound up entering consent decrees, pursuant to which the company agreed to pay contingent bondholders $3.9 million, with additional sums payable according to future profitability of the railroad, which wouldn't actually happen because it wouldn't be profitable. The total settlement was $4.1 million, and that was to be paid by January 8th, 1978. 1977, though, was kind of the year that everything finally caught up with the road. Deferred maintenance had 4,000 miles of railroad under slow orders. Their track conditions were atrocious all over the place, and the main line through Montana was actually averaging a derailment every single day. Yes, a single derailment every day. Every day a train came off the rails. That's horrid! I'd never even heard of such a thing. Shippers routed their freight over rival lines as schedules became non-existent and transit times went up. It used to be that you could get your freight from the Pacific Coast to Chicago in about 55 hours, but now it was taking over 140 hours. Damaged freight totaled just under $10 million for the year, which is never good for any company. And it was much worse than Burlington Northern's damaged freight for that year, $3.6 million. The cost of the derailments, because of course they're expensive, were about $4 million a month. And I'm pretty sure it might have been cheaper to just maintain the friggin' lines. They were also having an equipment shortage, partially due to that leasing thing I mentioned earlier, but also because of a weird policy where they parked any car that needed more than $500 worth of repairs. They just wouldn't fix them, they just leave them there. Their locomotives were in a similar state. They had a run-to-failure policy, and whenever they did finally break, if the locomotive had a major failure, they were also simply parked. They weren't fixed. During that year, the winter in that area was rough, and by the end of it, the lack of maintenance compounded, and half of their fleet was dead in the water. They were out of money, and on December 19, 1977, the Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul, and Pacific Railway filed for reorganization with the Federal Bankruptcy Court in Chicago, Illinois. They did it again. Now, most people would end the story here because by 1985, the Milwaukee Road would be absorbed and taken over by another rail line, the Soo Line, which was actually a subsidiary of Canadian Pacific. But that wasn't quite the end of the story, at least not as far as the investigation was concerned. A lot of things came out during the bankruptcy proceedings that deeply alarmed the ICC, actually. They wound up auditing the Milwaukee Road's own books, which none of the auditors commissioned by the trustee had actually done, for the years of 1976 through 1978. They found out that for some reason, the Milwaukee Road had been double entering expenses on lines west. No one ever figured out who authorized this practice, or who specifically was doing it, but the auditors found it and were able to derive accurate figures for profits on lines west. What they found was that instead of the completely atrocious money pit the trustee said it was, the extension had actually contributed profits of $12.7 million in 1976, $11 million in 1977, and $2.9 million in 1978. It's probably worth mentioning that these 3 years are well into the decline of traffic on the western lines, due to the deteriorated trackage and transit times, and the refusal by the company to supply cars to western customers. The ICC was so alarmed by this that they had another group of auditors go over the books just to be sure they were right. They were. In 1978, lines west of Miles City, Montana, had generated $150 million in revenue. That's alongside the $64 million in business they'd turned away due to lack of car supply. Lines west revenues would have equaled those of lines east, while having only about 25% of the total route miles and 20% of the employees of the system. The bankruptcy court noted that on average, a carload of transcontinental freight contributed $1,000 towards overhead, while the same carload handled only on lines east contributed only about $100. The ICC concluded that the drop from 1977 to 1978 was due to the trustees' practice of discouraging traffic, which the Milwaukee's own management had started doing in 1974. This information didn't come out till January of 1980. It's ludicrous to think about, because based on this, it almost seems like the suits in charge of the Milwaukee Road wanted the company to fail. Like, they couldn't have been that inept as to do this kind of stuff on purpose, could they? Real talk, they were either stupid or they were intentionally trying to kill the rail line. No evidence in terms of motivations or reasonability has ever come out. Stuff like this can be debated back and forth, but I'm here to give you the facts. The fact is, the Milwaukee Road no longer exists in its original form. On January 1st, 1986, the Milwaukee Road was officially absorbed by the Soo Line. These days, their original trackage is still used, but it's been divided into a bunch of other large companies. The trackage in South Dakota and Montana is operated by BNSF. Trackage in Washington is now operated by Union Pacific. Trackage in the Midwest is now operated by Canadian Pacific, which again was Soo Line's parent company. And some trackage in Wisconsin and Illinois is now operated by Wisconsin and Southern Railroad. Rest in peace, Milwaukee Road. You guys are made of madness. British Railways, which would eventually trade as British Rail as of 1965, was originally established by the Transport Act of 1947, which nationalized the entirety of the United Kingdom's railway system. Prior to that, it had been under control of what was known as the Big Four, which in themselves came into being as a result of the Railways Act of 1921, a process known as the grouping. The Big Four were the Great Western Railway, London, Midland and Scottish Railway, London and North Eastern Railway, and Southern Railway. But due to the downslope the railways had been experiencing post-World War II, the government felt the need to step in and fully nationalize the entirety of railway operations in the country. It wasn't something unheard of. A lot of other countries had done that already. The effectiveness of nationalized railways does vary, but sometimes it can work out. A lot of railways actually operate this way even now. Here in America, Amtrak is the American equivalent of a nationalized passenger railway network, although our freight operations are still private enterprise. Now, when I say British Rail encompassed the entirety of the UK's railway lines, I do mean the major lines. There were still some small, lighter railways that were left to their own devices, but for the most part the government now controlled the majority of the rail network in the United Kingdom. Initially, British Railways was divided up into 6 distinctive regions, mostly based on the territories the Big Four already covered, but if you notice, these are 6 regions, not 4, so they were divided up a little bit differently. The Eastern region was the London and North Eastern lines south of the Shaftholme Junction and Doncaster. The Northeastern region was the London and North Eastern lines that were north of the Shaftholme Junction. The London Midland region was the LMS lines in England and Wales. The Scottish region was just all the lines in Scotland. It was actually pretty simple that way. The Southern region was all of the Southern Railways lines, and the Western region was all of the Great Western Railways lines. Initially, the reason they divided things up this way was actually to try to make the transition a lot easier. A lot of the previous management and employees of the railway that already existed were still kind of left in charge of their own distinct territories. Even though they were now government-owned, they still operated separately, and it would be a slow process to kind of unify them. This would create friction over time. Some people just didn't want the government to own the railways. They still wanted to do things their own way, and over time they were kind of forced to accept that this was the new normal when it came to the UK railway network. The first thing that the British Railways Board did was actually to repair the infrastructure. Even though the war had been over for quite some time, there was still some damage as a result of bomb runs, as well as a significant backlog of maintenance. And as weird as it is for me to say, at first, they actually did an okay job. By the early 1950s, the railways, despite technically being on the downslope, were making a little bit of a profit. Not a lot, but they were in the black, which for a government-run body is actually really good. Government programs have a history of not making any money, of costing a lot of money.
British Railways was not just breaking even at the time, but actually making a profit. That's like the golden child of government-run programs already. They were doing a solid job. But the concern was the state of the railways and their future. The railways still operated in a pretty old-school way. It wasn't just that they still used steam locomotives, that was part of it, but it was also their general operation. They still used wagon-based freight, for example, and a lot of the rolling stock, including their coaches, were considered old and outdated. The thought was put forward to not only replace the steam locomotives with modern diesels, but to also electrify a significant portion of the major rail lines. Electrification had been proven to be effective, both in certain places in the UK as well as all over the world. Electric locomotives were a lot more efficient. So the notion of trying to invest some of the money they were making into electrifying the lines did make some sense, as well as getting some more modern diesel units. But there was significant resistance to this, actually. The Labour government under Clement Attlee was actually deeply opposed to it, because they were worried about the coal industry. The UK had a lot of coal, and still actually does, frankly. But diesels don't use coal. They use oil. Well, diesel fuel, but that comes from oil. If they switched entirely over to diesel units, however modern they may be, the UK would suddenly have to import a ton of oil to fuel them, whereas the steam engines could utilize home-mined coal. Robin Riddles didn't like it either. He was, well, basically the chief mechanical engineer of British Railways, so that wasn't officially his title. Officially, he was member of the Railway Executive for Mechanical and Electrical Engineering. So he was the chief mechanical engineer, is what you're trying to say. Just say that. You don't have to overcomplicate things. Riddles didn't like it because he felt it would be too expensive to import oil given the large amounts of coal they just had. Under him, the railway continued to order more steam locomotives built, resulting in many of the standard classes that, in their defense, were actually excellent for the most part. New steam engines are great, but they weren't enough to actually replace all the rolling stock they already had, particularly the really old steam locomotives. Some of the locomotives they were using were actually built in the late 1800s. Even if they were going to stick with steam, they still had to replace these old locomotives. They just weren't going to cut it in the modern railway, not at all. But as a result of future events we're going to get to, most of the new steam locomotives they ordered would not at all serve out the time frame they were intended for. The standard classes were built to last at least 30 years. None of them served nearly that long. And by the middle of the 50s, British Railways suddenly found themselves in a lot of trouble. See, their freight haulage, which had been their main moneymaker, was starting to get squeezed out by road traffic and air traffic. Trucks on the roads were becoming a lot more common, and planes were making it so that if you need something very fast, it's actually better to just put it on a plane and it'll get there tomorrow. Possibly even later that same day if it's staying in the UK. Point was that they were in dire need of something, and they felt that if they modernized themselves and made themselves seem a little less dated, maybe that would fix a lot of the problems. It actually would mostly result in a lot more problems. And let's talk about that, because this is where things get absolutely horrifying if you're a fan of trains at all. To call the modernization plan a horror story is probably an exaggeration on my part, I admit this, but I'm sticking with that, because I don't think they could have handled it any worse. Though I will admit there were parts of this that actually turned out alright. The report that the modernization plan comes from is formally known as the Modernization and Re-Equipment of the British Railways. It was officially published in December of 1954, and it was meant to bring the railway system up to date. A white paper that was produced in 1956 stated that the modernization would help eliminate British Rail's financial troubles by 1962. I'm sorry, that's funny to me. Hindsight is 20/20, I know, but wow, that's wrong. The actual goals highlighted for the plan was to increase speed, reliability, safety, and line capacity. The total cost was projected to be about £1.24 billion. In modern money, that's about £30 billion, give or take. So even by design, the modernization plan was going to be outrageously expensive. The specific areas that were going to be covered during the plan was the electrification of principal main lines, such as the ones in the eastern region, Kent, Birmingham, and central Scotland. This is the part of the plan that I think is actually alright. Electrifying lines would allow them to use electric locomotives. In the long run, that could save them a lot of money. So that part's okay. Large-scale dieselization to replace steam locomotives. Now, that's a double-edged sword because we already talked about the coal issue, and as someone who, again, has hindsight in his favor, I know how badly this went. But on paper, a lot of other rail lines were doing it all over the world. Steam engines were being replaced, and a lot of railways were seeing success with the diesels. So, in their defense at the time, with the way they were looking at it, if they handled this well, they won't, but if they had handled it well, this wouldn't be the worst idea either. New passenger and freight rolling stock, that part also makes sense. A lot of the rolling stock they were using, such as the cars, just were old. They needed to be replaced. Simple as that. Resignaling and track renewal, another excellent idea. A closure of a small number of lines that were seen as unnecessary in a nationalized network, as they duplicated other lines, which also makes sense, as well, and this is a big one, as the building of large freight marshalling yards with automated shunting to streamline freight handling. This is a terrible idea. The reason why this is bad is that a massive amount of money went into building new marshalling yards and investing in old ones when small wagon load traffic that they were still using was in a really steep decline. Modern railways use containers. Wagon load style trains were inefficient and were rapidly being scooped up by truck traffic. These new yards weren't going to be new at all. They were still utilizing old school techniques that were no longer going to be working. And they should have known that. But they ignored it, believing that if they just add more yards, it'll increase their overall efficiency and that'll fix the problem. It didn't. This would be a massive waste of money. But more on that in a second. Now, the electrification of the lines actually went okay. That part of the plan, like I said, was a good idea, and it went alright. It resulted in the procurement of a lot of new electric locomotives, most of which were actually decent. Like, the vast majority of the electric locomotives that British Rail got their hands on were actually alright. But what about the diesels? Let's talk about that. But let me preface this with the fact that when it comes to these diesels, I'm going to be referring to them by their TOPS classifications. Now, the TOPS system is actually one of the better things that British Rail would wind up implementing in the long run, but TOPS wouldn't actually be a thing until the 60s. So these diesels would have been called something different when they were first built and introduced, whereas they would have been given a new TOPS classification later. But just for the sake of clarity and efficiency, just so we know what I'm talking about all the time, I'm just going to call them by their TOPS names because that's generally what everyone calls them anyway. Now, like I said, the modernization plan called for the large-scale introduction of diesel locomotives. Initially, a total of 2,500 locomotives for mainline service were to be procured in 10 years, at a cost of about £125 million. That's a little over $3 billion in modern money, which is still a lot of money, but the total program was going to be a lot of money, so fair enough. They also wanted to replace much of the existing pre-war passenger rolling stock with over 5,000 diesel or electric multiple units. That was going to cost at least £285 million, roughly $7 billion in modern money. Electrification, of course, was part of this, but the diesels were actually meant to be a stopgap in the long run. In the end, they wanted most of the routes, the big ones especially, to be electrified. The diesels were meant to replace the steam engines, and then they themselves would be replaced by electric units further down the road. It sounds weird, but on paper it probably made some level of sense, as the plan didn't actually call for that many diesels initially. They thought the diesels would be efficient and fast enough that they didn't need as many of them as they needed steam locomotives, if that makes any sense. By the end of this whole thing, and with the acquisition of 1,100 electric locomotives for about £60 million, $1.5 billion, plus another £125 million, or $3 billion, for the electric infrastructure, the diesels would then be used for more minor routes as well as shunting and certain freight movements. But this was a complete reversal from the way British Railways had been doing things. Initially, British Railways was full tilt into steam locomotives. In fact, in its early years, British Railways had largely halted work done on the Big Four's experiments with diesel traction. The only ones that actually saw any significant use would become the British Rail Class 08, which they wound up building a ton of. But barring that exception, mainline diesels were out of the question, at least for the first decade or so, until the modernization plan decided, oh wait, no, we're gonna build all the diesels in the universe. Even though they were still in the process of filling orders for the standard steam locomotives, they then, at the same time, were starting to identify contractors that could build diesels specifically to replace the steam locomotives they were still in the process of building, which seems really counterintuitive. Like, you're building more steam locomotives, they're only gonna last 5 years, why would you build them at all? Now, the idea of implementing diesel traction, especially in those days, did make some logical sense, like I said. A lot of railways found cost-saving measures within diesel traction. It was a good idea at the time. But they didn't have that much experience with diesels. The UK was definitely behind the curve. Over here in America, EMD had been doing work on diesels since the 30s. The Big Four had only really started seriously messing with diesels after World War II. So most of the workforce when it came to procuring diesels within the UK was severely inexperienced. The plan was to commission orders for 174 diesel locomotives from 6 independent manufacturers. Due to politics as well as currency concerns, they insisted that every manufacturer be in the UK, which is part of the issue. Like I just said, most of the UK manufacturers had no experience building diesels, like at all. They had no idea what they were doing. They'd been building steam engines all this time. So this was a very, very new thing for them to be doing. Now, building 174 total diesel locomotives just for testing actually does make some sense, though. That's not a lot of diesels, like, at all. And in the long run, they would need thousands. So to build a few, a few hundred, just to test them out, see where the problems are, that's reasonable. That's a good approach. That is not how this went, though. Due to political, of course, and economic events, British Rail's financial position was worsening. Their accounts had shown an overall negative balance since 1954, and in 1956 their net revenue fell into the negative for the first time. Costs were climbing, and the market share and volumes of both passenger and freight were falling. They were also facing a bit of a manpower shortage. So the British Transport Commission, or BTC, and BR management decided to expand the pilot scheme to hasten the introduction of diesels. In May of 1957, which was a month before the first locomotive ordered under the original pilot scheme, the English Electric Type 1s, or Class 20s under tops, entered service, the total orders were increased to 230. Not an unreasonable increase, but then in late 1958, as their financial balance approached an annual loss of £100 million, and before many of the diesels that they actually ordered were built, they further accelerated the whole thing to introduce 2,300 diesel locomotives by the end of 1963. An insane increase on diesels that you have not yet managed to test. Many of these diesels hadn't even entered the prototype stage. Many of them were ordered literally off the drawing board. They had a drawing of the diesel, and they said, yes, I would like so many of those. Numerous different manufacturers were being required to produce their own designs to meet various deadlines. And this is a problem, because part of the modernization plan would be to standardize the railways. That was impossible. The manufacturers were rushing, and all of them had very different ideas of what diesel traction in the UK should be. The locomotives they produced were largely incompatible, and some of them worked completely differently from each other. The Deltics were wholly unique, the diesel hydraulics and diesel electrics didn't get along, and even among the ones that used the same kind of traction, all diesel electric, were still woefully different in terms of inner components. There was no cross-compatibility, there was no standardization, there was nothing that could have resulted in a decent, efficient railway network. It wasn't just that they produced a lot of bad diesels. They did do that, but they also produced a ton of rolling stock that was in no way meant to work with each other at all. They had the same rail gauge, they had the same couplers, but beyond that, they were internally different, and consistent and effective maintenance on these things was going to be a complete nightmare. There were a total of 14 distinct locomotive designs. Any benefit or cost savings they could have gained from switching over to diesels was completely lost because of the incompatible nature of the diesels. Remember, these designs were meant to be ordered in a very small number and tested and put up against one another to decide which ones worked the best for the rail lines. Instead, they just wound up ordering a ton and threw them out there and hoped for the best. And it didn't help, I promise you, it didn't help when a significant portion of the designs were actually terrible. The reason why British Rail becomes a meme on this channel is that one of my biggest draws is the top 5 worst trains ever list. I have been doing that since the very beginning. And almost every single list has at least one thing from British Rail. And why? Because a lot of the diesels they produced during this time were absolutely, unconditionally, unspeakably terrible. Just The worst. The Class 15s, the Class 16s, the Class 17s were all garbage. The Class 21s caught fire. And those are just a handful of examples. By the early 60s, the reliability and availability of the locomotives was proven to be just not there. They didn't have any. And availability is one thing. If a locomotive can't pull a train, that's a problem. You gotta replace it with another locomotive. But what if it broke down on the main line? Then that train is stuck there and those passengers are inconvenienced. But also, any trains behind it that need to use that line can't go because there's a train in the way. They have to take time to move it. That's a lot of time that's lost, and it only made British Rail look worse to the public eye. If people are trying to use any kind of travel system, they want efficiency. They want that thing to appear at the time it says it's going to be there, to leave at the time it's supposed to, and to arrive when it says it's going to. A little bit of delay is sometimes understandable depending on the person, but these were massive, unspeakable delays. And you're already struggling with ridership retention. Now your trains aren't even operating. At least when they were still using the steam locomotives mostly, the steam engines were old, but they worked. And the heck of it was, a lot of the locomotives that they even got, even the ones that worked, were found ultimately to be rather useless. See, they ordered them on a like-for-like basis when it came to replacing the steam locomotives. As an example, large numbers of light-duty diesels were meant for local mixed goods services. But the orders failed to take into account the decline in local and branch line goods services, meaning they had a bunch of diesels sitting around to replace the steam locomotives, when in reality they could have just reduced the amount of locomotives overall and been a lot better off. Also, and this is very important to me, they ordered an absolutely insane amount of shunting diesels, but that was for their new marshalling yards. And like I mentioned earlier, container freight was taking over, and many of those diesels they ordered would only work a few years before they would be scrapped anyway. It was a complete waste of money. The other thing the modernization plan failed to do was redefine what the purpose of the railways was. British Rail was trapped, being bound by the Railway and Canal Traffic Acts, which meant that it had to provide carriage for virtually any type of goods, regardless of quantity, between any two stations of the network at set and published rates. This is a problem because this legislation dated back to the 19th century, the 1800s, and it was meant to prevent the railways from abusing their monopoly as the sole practical long-distance transport provider. It was basically the British equivalent of the ICC. They were established for the same reasons and were outdated for the same reasons. At the time it made sense because there was really no competitor when it came to long-distance traffic with the railways, but now we had planes and cars. And road freight operators had no legal restrictions and could turn down work that was uneconomic, and British Rail couldn't. They could also easily undercut British Railways' carriage rates, which the railway could not alter without legal consent. This is all hilarious to me, by the way, because I was under the impression that the whole point of a nationalized railway network was to avoid all the government nonsense bureaucracy that comes with being privately owned business. Why can't they just change the law for British Railways? You don't have to worry about a monopoly anymore. You own the rail lines! You are the rail lines! The government was literally shooting themselves in the foot on this. That same act also forced British Railways to maintain thousands of goods yards and other facilities, plus rolling stock and staff to service them, even when there was ever-decreasing demand for those services. This problem had actually dated back to the Great Depression, and the Big Four themselves had campaigned to repeal the act during the 1930s. But that didn't happen until the Transport Act of 1962 gave British Railways, finally, freedom of contract. The timing of the modernization plan was also really bad, because just months after its publication, the train drivers' trade union, ASLEF, called a strike that lasted 17 days, and that caused a major disruption on the network. Many of British Rail's long-standing freight customers were forced to start using road transport and never returned to the railways after that. How do you let a strike last 17 days? Could you not negotiate in that amount of time? I mean, come on! As you might imagine, like any government program, the total cost of the modernization plan was vastly more than they actually prepared for. It exceeded £1.6 billion. That's about $34 billion in today's money. And their losses only increased as traffic volumes and market share continued to decline. Some of the locomotives they did get were successful and would go on to have very long service lines, but many were absolutely atrocious and cost more money than they ever saved British Rail. And those fancy marshalling yards they built? Well, throughout the 60s, as wagon load freight declined, many of them wound up mostly empty. Another complete waste of money. It isn't so much that the modernization plan was a bad idea. Their railways did need to be modernized. The UK's railways did need to be modernized. But the way they went about this is nothing short of a complete disaster. The only good that ever came out of it was the electrification. They did get a lot of that done. And like I said, a lot of those locomotives were actually okay. It did help increase efficiencies in certain areas of the rail line, but the inefficient diesels they procured, plus a lack of use for the marshalling yards they built, meant that there was no way to recover the amount of money that they put into this thing. It would be a long time before British railways would get back on track.
The late 1940s and into the 1950s were starting to become really rough for a lot of rail lines. With the advent of the interstate highway system in America, many families owning their own cars, as well as the affordability of modern air travel, people just weren't using the rail lines to travel nearly as much. And even the freight department was suffering, with many companies choosing to ship by truck instead. Now out west, railroads like Union Pacific were able to stay afloat due to the distances involved out there. Shipping goods by plane was not very efficient unless you needed it to get there like tomorrow. And sending a massive amount of goods a long distance wasn't necessarily great going by truck. Trains were still better for shipping in bulk and long distances, and companies like Union Pacific and Santa Fe weren't doing as well as they once had, but were still doing alright. But the East Coast was a lot more densely populated, with a lot more short-haul runs, and the railroad's short-haul runs were slowly being taken over by trucking and aircraft. Whether it's passenger or freight, they were being sandwiched between these two other mediums for travel, and it was beginning to cause problems. New York Central and the Pennsy had been rivals for a very long time, and their lines often ran parallel to each other. The notion of them merging was something that had been debated in the late 1950s, but neither company really wanted to do that because they just didn't really like each other. They managed themselves in very different ways, which will be relevant later. But a lot of other rail companies over on the East Coast were starting to merge in order to bail themselves out of the situation. The Erie Railroad had merged with Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western to become Erie-Lackawanna Railway in 1960. Chesapeake and Ohio Railway wound up acquiring control of Baltimore and Ohio, and Norfolk and Western actually absorbed several railroads, which included the Nickel Plate and Wabash. Both New York Central and the Pennsylvania Railroad had looked to merge with some of these other smaller railways around them, but none of them were interested in merging with them in particular. So really it was down to just them. Another problem they were working with was the ICC, or the Interstate Commerce Commission. The ICC was a government entity that was put into place by the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887. They were specifically meant originally just to regulate the railroads to ensure fair rates and eliminate rate discrimination. Back then, railroad tycoons were either slashing prices or charging extraordinary prices if they had a monopoly on a certain area. The ICC was meant to limit this, but by this time, some of their policies were largely becoming obsolete. They wouldn't just allow the railroads to raise or lower their rates very easily, and this made it very difficult for any rail line in America to stay competitive with either trucking or the airlines. They were largely in the way at this point, rather than actually helping. They also were in charge of approving such a massive merger because both New York Central and the Pennsy were enormous rail lines on their own. When they combined, Penn Central was an absolute gargantuan rail line, and none of them were even sure if the ICC was going to allow them to do it just because of how much territory they would encompass. The ICC would eventually allow this, but it would take nearly 10 years for them to actually approve it, as they were notorious for dragging their feet when it came to mergers of any kind, because of course they were.
Can we please merge now? Nope. How about now? Nope. Can we do it now? No.
The ICC only approved the merger following a handful of conditions. The new company, which was to be called Penn Central, had to take over the freight and passenger operations of the bankrupt New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad. They did this on December 31st, 1968, but they never really wanted to do that. New Haven was a complete frickin' disaster at that time. They hadn't been making profits in years on any of their lines. Managing them and attempting to make them work was something that they didn't want to have to deal with, but they didn't really have a choice. They also were supposed to absorb New York Susquehanna and Western Railway. They attempted it, but they couldn't actually agree on the price, so NYS&W actually wound up becoming part of the Delaware Otsego system. They were also to make the Lehigh Valley Railroad available for merger by either N&W or C&O. If neither of them wanted it, they were supposed to absorb it themselves. Lehigh Valley was reluctant to merge in general, and struggled along on their own, and actually wound up entering bankruptcy a little after Penn Central would. Spoiler on that. But, either way, Penn Central went ahead, officially being a thing on February 1st, 1968. At the time of the merger, Alfred E. Perlman had been the head of New York Central, and I've always thrown shade at him for his policy for not preserving any steam locomotives because I think it is stupid. But outside of that, he did make a lot of legitimately good business decisions, and he had been generally responsible for keeping New York Central afloat, and he was known to be a forward-thinking innovator. He pushed for dieselization, obviously, but he also made a lot of changes to streamline the operations of New York Central in general, saving them money in the long run. Many of his innovations are actually standard things that a lot of Class 1 railroads use now. The Pennsy had been headed by a man named Stuart T. Saunders, who was a lot more conservative than Perlman. He wasn't necessarily bad at his job, but he and the rest of the Pennsy suits were very, very old school in their approach, and this would create a lot of friction between the two sides. They were supposed to be working together, but New York Central's team, which was known as Green Hats, and the Pensy's team, which was known as the Red Hats, were at odds with a lot of policy decisions. Perlman desperately wanted the entire railway to move forward and innovate. Saunders was kind of on his side to a degree, but a lot of the board members weren't, and this created a lot of friction over time. The merger itself was also a strange one, as normally when rail lines merge, it's to extend their operations. It's normally an end-to-end merger sort of thing, just to make the lines longer. But in Penn Central's case, the original railways had occupied much of the same territory, with most of their lines running parallel to one another. This created a lot of redundancies, things that would desperately need to be streamlined, as they'd already had a ton of track that they weren't using even by themselves. Now they basically doubled their infrastructure, and their taxes, and they didn't need the vast majority of it. In fact, paying for stuff they really didn't need would encompass a lot of their misfortunes. It was actually most of their problems. Perlman didn't even want to merge with the Pennsy in the first place. He felt that their rail lines were not as immaculate and as strong as they appeared outwardly. And to a certain extent, he may have been right, because the Pensy's board members weren't willing to innovate, and they desperately needed to in that era. Penn Central's total assets upon the merger were more than $5 billion in 1968 money, and they had a projected revenue of more than $1.7 billion annually. That sounds really good, and on paper it was, but there'd been a significant lack of management when it came to actually running such a massive railroad and integrating two railroads that really didn't run the same. Their corporate structure was completely different, and so was the way they handled their trains. Under the merger, Perlman was the president director and the chief administrative officer, while Saunders was the railroad's chairman and CEO. And these two in particular seem to have worked alright together, but Saunders was not Perlman. He had a lot more of a reserved ideology, and he was known to be a strong negotiator, but he was also kind of an appeaser. One of the major problems the railroad had was the payroll. They just had too many employees. Normally when companies merge, there's an elimination process. Duplicate routes are torn up, terminals, trackage, and redundant things in general are taken out of the company because they just don't need them. Why pay the taxes and upkeep when you aren't using it? It doesn't make any sense. And to be honest, I know Twitter's gonna hate this, but employees fall under that category too. There are times when layoffs need to happen to keep a company afloat. I know being at the bottom and looking up, you might think that these companies have an infinite amount of money, and therefore can afford it. But you know what? That's not always true. Many of these companies are in fact living in glass houses that could easily shatter if any mistake is made. And in Penn Central's case, that's exactly what happened. They had a ton of money. Their net worth was ludicrous for the time. And yet, they failed, and part of the reason is that they didn't get rid of hardly any employees. In fact, they got more. Saunders had been responsible for negotiating with the unions and gave in to pretty much every single thing the unions wanted. And unions are there to protect employees, and I get that. Also, they take a part of your check out for that protection, which seems really toxic. Actually, wait a minute, I don't know if this is supposed to work that way. You became the very thing you sought to destroy. But unions also usually don't take into account the company's need to stay afloat. I mean, you're there to protect people's jobs, but ironically, in some cases, like this one, they were directly responsible for people losing their jobs because the company went under. Saunders chose to agree to the terms that every employee from both companies was retained, that huge severance packages were promised to anyone who was fired, and several thousand more employees were rehired that had been laid off previously. Honestly, even just one of these demands was a stretch for the company at the time. If it were me, I'd tolerate the severance packages maybe, but every employee from both companies being retained? That just doesn't make any sense. You're basically paying a bunch of guys to stand around because there just wasn't work for them. And rehiring a bunch of other employees? Are you kidding me? No, of course not. Ridiculous. But Saunders gave in, and this caused Penn Central's payroll to skyrocket, to the point that operating costs were way higher than they should have been.
We want all the things!
You want everything?
Yes, we want everything! Give it to us now! The workers demand it! Also, they pay us dues!
But if we give you everything, we can't afford anything!
Too bad! Give us it all!
Okay, you can have whatever you want. I'm sorry. Don't yell at me. Saunders, you agreed to give them how much money? I'm sorry, Mr. Perlman. You know what this means, Saunders. It means it's time for my chainsaw. I'm sorry, Mr. Perlman, please.
Prior to the merger, the respective railways' operating ratios were always pretty high. An operating ratio is a term that describes operating expenses as a percentage when compared to the revenue of a company. Naturally, you always want that to be below 100, but anything over 80 is considered very high. By modern standards, Class 1 railroads these days usually try to stay within about the 60% margin. Naturally, they want to get it lower because, of course, that means more profit for them, but it's not always feasible. Either way, prior to the merger, both New York Central and the Pennsy had operating ratios that were above 81%. With the extra payroll and infrastructure they didn't need, that went well above 100. And even when they did merge, their cash reserves, like extra money just sitting around just in case, was only about $13 million, which again, sounds like a lot, but for a railway this size, it wasn't. Even the Pennsy by itself needed more than 3 times that amount every day for operating expenses.
So, what's the job today, Barry? Nothing. Nothing? Nothing. They hired a bunch of other guys to do it, so we got nothing to do. Just standing around. We're standing around and getting paid for it? Yeah, that's about right. Oh. Can the company afford that? I don't know, man. I don't ask these questions. I still don't know what a steam engine is. For the love of God, Barry, how many times do I have to explain this?
Now, it wasn't like Perlman and Saunders were stupid. They knew a lot of this. Saunders made a mistake by giving in to the unions, but it might have been fixed if they had cut costs in other areas. For example, one of the things he and Perlman wanted to do was construct new automated freight yards at both Selkirk and Albany, New York, as well as adding another one over in Columbus, Ohio. These yards would streamline operations quite a bit and save them money, and New York Central had actually been implementing such upgrades for a while under Perlman. The Pennsy had ignored such an idea entirely. They also wanted to introduce an early computerized system for monitoring and tracing freight cars. This kind of technology was very innovative back then, and is actually standard these days in upgraded form. Such a thing would have helped Penn Central overall if they could have implemented it, but they never had the chance to. Normally with a merger, you want things to be slow and processed out. You want to ease people into it rather than just thrusting the companies together and letting them fend for themselves, which is actually what they wound up doing. The reason they did this was because of the ICC. They had taken so long to approve the merger that neither side of the arrangement was really sure it would ever happen. So neither New York Central or the Pennsy wanted to invest the capital into the programs. When the ICC finally did give them the go-ahead, they had to merge their operating departments from day one. They had hoped that doing something so catastrophic would actually just kind of work itself out. It didn't. It resulted in mass chaos. See, for example, none of the classification clerks that were responsible for planning the routes for the freight cars and stuff had actually been taught the roughly 5,000 new combinations for those routings. Thousands of cars began being sent to the completely wrong yards. Basic locations were a mystery to some of the staff. One time, former New York Central employees, now under Penn Central of course, had to make sure one of the cars was sent to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Harrisburg, by the way, is the capital of PA. It's kind of a major city in the state. As the capital, just throwing it out there. Well, the former New York Central employees didn't know where Harrisburg was, so they sent it to Pittsburgh instead, which is like 4 hours drive away. It's really not even close. This horrific mismanagement also nearly destroyed another railway that had nothing to do with Penn Central, Bangor and Aroostook. They were a small railroad that served northern Maine, and they were often called just the Bar. A major source of their freight operations had actually been potatoes. Potato farming was very common up in Maine. They grew well, and farmers sold them to the rest of the country. It was pretty normal. They shipped them by rail because it was the most efficient means to do so. They could send an entire season's worth of potatoes on the railways and get them to the rest of the country and make their sales. Good deal. And it had been a profitable venture for everybody involved for many years. But like I said, the bar was small. They had to go through Penn Central to get their shipment to the rest of the country. But when they did this in 1969, Penn Central lost the shipment at the Selkirk yard. That shipment consisted of the entire season's worth of potatoes. The whole crop rotted in the yard because they screwed it up. A lot of farms with no revenue from selling their potatoes because they couldn't sell rotted potatoes wound up shutting down, and the ones that could make it through the crisis swore never to use the rail lines to ship their crops ever again. The bar was nearly forced into bankruptcy from losing such a massive source of their revenue, and it just made Penn Central look even more silly. It wasn't like the suits weren't aware of the problems, but each side had a very different method for how to deal with it. The Red Hats of the Pennsy and the Green Hats of New York Central kept arguing with each other. The Green Hats had been hired mostly by Perlman, and they were young, ambitious, and forward-thinking, and the Red Hats were old-school, old men who wanted things to stay the way they already were, and do what worked, not try new experiments. They didn't get along, and their arguing wasted time while their rail line was hemorrhaging money all over the place. A man named David Bidvon, who had come in from the Pennsy, was actually head of Penn Central's financial department. He was known to be kind of full of himself, but he was very good at his job. He was a numbers guy. And then one of the things he wound up doing to help Penn Central stay afloat and hopefully fix their trouble was take out just a stupid amount of loans that would help finance their operations. The problem with loans is this: you have to pay them back, and you have to pay them back with interest. So in the long run, it only compounded Penn Central's problems. Bivon's thinking that eventually the railroad would straighten itself out and be profitable again, and they could start paying off their massive debt. This would never actually occur, though. Perlman had also been known to be very outspoken, wanting things done a certain way, and to be fair, he was often correct in his analysis, but the former Pennsy brass really hated just the heck out of him for it.
These darn kids don't know how to run a rail line like we do.
All I'm simply suggesting, men, is that we try to innovate and limit our costs.
We don't have to innovate. We're old. Old people don't need to change.
No, you don't understand. We won't be around forever, and times are changing. It's just time for a new methodology, a new outlook on railroading.
No, never. We will never change. Not for you, not for anyone else. Saunders, quick, back us up on this.
Yeah, I agree with that. We probably shouldn't change it all. And maybe we give the union some more money. I think that's a good idea.
They managed to con Saunders into getting enough votes to stage a coup and have Perlman removed from his position, replacing him on August 29, 1969, with a man named Paul Gorman instead. Perlman was actually given mostly a lame duck position of vice chairman. Eventually, he would just kind of leave. And he wound up proving that he probably knew exactly what he was talking about when he came to what he wanted to do. He became the head of Western Pacific, which had been struggling for a while, and swiftly turned their bad situation around right before it was finally purchased by Union Pacific. Under Gorman, well, Penn Central's situation didn't change, at all. It was still horrible. They were still just bleeding cash all over the lines, just everywhere. And all Bavon kept doing was keep the creditors quiet and trying to find new sources for loans. More loans, because he had nothing else he could possibly do about the situation. Then, he did something rather, illegal. He propped up worsening numbers through paper profits and other shady things, sometimes called cooking the books. This made the investors think that Penn Central was actually doing alright, when in reality, they really couldn't have been in a worse situation. By the end of 1969, the railroad had lost over $300 million since the merger, and the end of such losses seemed to be nowhere in sight. In just the first quarter of 1970 alone, they'd lost another $100 million, which is more than $1 million a day. Their track conditions suffered, and many of the locomotives that they did have had to be operated at restricted speed, which meant a lot of late shipments, which only made them look worse. Every single thing they did to try to bail themselves out of the situation made them look even worse. In June of 1970, Bavon reported to Saunders that he had completely exhausted any and all possible monetary means of dealing with the situation. There was nothing more he could do. If federal assistance couldn't be secured, then bankruptcy was their only option. June 21st, 1970, Penn Central's board voted to seek voluntary relief from their creditors under Section 77 of the Federal Bankruptcy Act. The reaction from everybody around them was actually shock. Wall Street and other business sectors never believed that this massive railway, that was a combination of two of the greatest in American history, would ever collapse. It was in fact the largest bankruptcy in American history for its time. It would only be superseded in 2001 by the Enron bankruptcy. But that's another story. This resulted in a serious period of uncertainty when it came to the Eastern Seaboard and the other rail lines. They weren't sure if they could keep their own freight moving, and many of their customers were also wary of using them. The company spent more than 3 years in receivership, but the trustees involved and everyone that really looked at it found that their problems were simply too complex for a traditional sort of reorganization. They couldn't just go in and divvy things up and be fine. Between the loans and the infrastructure issues, and really everything, there was way too much going on to just simply walk in and fix it. It wasn't going to happen. Though weirdly, in the end, Penn Central's failure actually wound up helping railroading in America overall. For years, the United States had struggled with the notion of a nationalized railway system. We didn't really want to do it necessarily. We'd actually done it once during World War I, but that was the only exception. For the most part, we're very capitalist over here. We want private companies to do private company things. Competition breeds innovation, etc., etc. So the government didn't really want to have to step in and do anything, but with passenger lines drying up, it was eventually decided that the government would have to do something if passenger service was going to be a thing in America on the rail lines. Amtrak wound up being launched on May 1st, 1971, for the sole purpose of relieving a lot of railroads' passenger operations. The railroads were no longer responsible for dealing with them, so they could focus on their freight lines, while Amtrak tried to make the passenger runs at least a little bit profitable, or bare minimum, stable. Since they were now government-owned, they didn't necessarily have to worry about making a massive profit, if any. However, much of Penn Central wound up under the control of another government-owned entity, Conrail, which was created on April 1st, 1976, that took over most of Penn Central, as well as the also bankrupt Erie-Lackawanna Railway. Conrail would go on to make a profit eventually, and was even privatized for a while, but not until some serious reforms came down. See, like I said in the beginning, a big part of why Penn Central struggled so hard, as well as many of the railways did, was just old laws that didn't need to be there. The ICC had too much power over them when it came to setting rates. They couldn't set rates to stay competitive with other industries. It just wasn't possible. This eventually resulted in the Staggers Rail Act of 1980. It deregulated the American railroad industry in many ways, including allowing rail carriers to establish any rate for a rail service unless the ICC were to determine that there was no effective competition for the rail services, which is a thing that very rarely happens. It did a bunch of other stuff, and we can make an entire video about that, but the point is, suddenly, Conrail, as well as a lot of the other rail lines, began actually making money again. Having the freedom supplied by the free market gave them a boost. And even before the Staggers Rail Act, there was also the 4R Act, which also helped quite a bit. It's a case where the government needed to take their hands off to make things work. And since we still have several big Class 1 railways in the country today, including Norfolk Southern, CSX, BNSF, and Union Pacific, I'd say it worked out pretty well. But as for Penn Central, it kind of remains an historical cautionary tale of what can happen when you don't go into a situation with any kind of real planning. Had the ICC not dragged their feet on the merger, they might have had time to actually plan things out and slowly merge together rather than just throwing everybody into it and hoping for the best. Saunders giving in to everything the unions wanted probably didn't help either. He could have served to actually negotiate and come to a compromise rather than just give them everything. And had the Pensies' bitter old men not been so bitter and old, maybe they would have been able to make some progression and allow Perlman to do his job as an innovator. Penn Central may have wound up being a rail line that we still see nowadays, and yet, instead, it became one of the most notorious failures in railroading history.